Jerusalem. The Israeli police recommended Tuesday that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu be charged with bribery, fraud and breach of trust in two parallel graft cases. The Attorney General must now decide whether to indict Mr. Netanyahu, a process that could take months. Here are highlights of the conclusions presented by police investigators. Case 1000 illicit gifts or allegations. Mr. Netanyahu accepted nearly $300,000 in gifts between 2007 and 2016 from two businessmen, the Hollywood producer Arnon Milchan and the Australian billionaire James Packer, gifts that grew in scope and frequency after Mr. Netanyahu became Prime Minister in 2009, a relationship of bribery. Mr. Netanyahu's relationship with Mr. Milchan was not an innocent relationship between friends. Rather, Mr. Milchan gave him gifts in return for his action to help Mr. Milchan in concrete ways, including financially. A shared burden. Mr. Milchan's gifts to Mr. Netanyahu, beginning in 2007, ran to more than $210,000. Mr. Packer's, dating to 2014, totaled more than $70,000. The two businessmen decided to share the Prime Minister's costs between them, the police said. A big tax break. Mr. Netanyahu tried to pass legislation that would double, to 20 years, the duration of a tax exemption for Israelis returning to the country from overseas, which would have vast financial value to Milchan. This was rejected by the Finance Ministry, then headed by Yair Lapid, now a chief opponent of Mr. Netanyahu's visa trouble. Mr. Netanyahu lobbied the Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, and the United States Ambassador to Israel at the time, Daniel B. Shapiro, to help Mr. Milchan deal with a problem extending his visa, which had far-reaching financial significance to the producer. A TV channel state Mr. Netanyahu, in his capacity as communications minister, tried to help Mr. Milchan become a shareholder in Israeli television's Channel 2. Tata. The Prime Minister tried to aid a project that Mr. Milchan was pursuing with Ratan Tata, the Indian billionaire, identified in Israeli news reports as a free trade zone proposed near the Israeli-Jordanian border. The Defense Ministry opposed it and the project went nowhere. The bottom line, according to the police, Mr. Netanyahu should be charged with accepting bribes, fraud and breach of trust in relation to Mr. Milchan, and only the latter two crimes in connection with Mr. Packer, and Mr. Milchan should be charged with giving bribes. No recommendation about Mr. Packer was made. Case 2000 backroom deals or allegations. Mr. Netanyahu and Arnon Moses, publisher of Yedioth Ahronot, one of Israel's leading newspapers, struck a barter deal in 2009 to advance their interests. In theory, Mr. Netanyahu would get positive and supportive coverage from Yedioth Ahronot. Whether that happened is unclear. Mr. Moses would get Mr. Netanyahu's support in promoting Yedioth Ahronot, including help curbing the strength of Israel Hayom, a free newspaper that is owned by Sheldon Adelson, a supporter of Mr. Netanyahu's, and that had become a powerful competitor to Yedioth. Crucial evidence. Audio recordings of meetings between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Moses were made secretly on the cell phone of Ari Haro, Mr. Netanyahu's former chief of staff, now a government witness. The bottom line, according to the police, Mr. Netanyahu should be charged with requesting a bribe, fraud and breach of trust, and Mr. Moses should be charged with offering a bribe. A version of this article appears in print on February 14, 2018, on page A9 of the New York edition, with the headline "Highlights from Parallel Cases in Israel Against Netanyahu."